Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give a couple seconds here for people to connect, but welcome if you've connected to your audio. Thank you for joining us. It'll be just a moment and we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ISPCAN Monthly Journal Club. My name is Jane Estes, and I'm the Knowledge and Content Development Manager for ISPCAN. ISPCAN's monthly international journal clubs are always free of charge and cover diverse research topics, which are presented by subject matter experts from around the globe. These 90-minute webinars are designed to help our members and partners in the ISPCAN community gain access to knowledge and expertise to inform care, improve practice, and drive policy change. All this critical to help improve outcomes for children globally. Because we believe that you should have access to all the information and resources available to support you in your work, we encourage you to visit our ISPCAN Knowledge Hub. The ISPCAN Knowledge Hub is an open-access, centralized library containing ISPCAN and partner resources. This collection of resources can be searched by critical topic, author, presenter, or type of resource, and is organized with all the supplemental materials and links that are also attached to make it very user-friendly. If you or your organization have an open access resource you'd like to share, please email me at partnerships@ispacan.org. But we encourage you to visit the Hub, where you'll find global reports, webinars, journal clubs, downloadable resources, and partner resources, as well as ISPCAN masterclasses. Today's topic, the Special Issue Journal, Indigenous Youth and Wellbeing, Risk and Resilience. Tips for making the most of today's session. Please engage with us. This session is meant to be an active, interactive learning platform. Please participate by sharing your comments in the chat and your questions in the Q&A box throughout the webinar. We will use your questions to begin the Q&A session immediately at the conclusion of the presentations. Also, please take a moment to introduce yourself to other attendees, our moderators, and our featured presenters in the chat box. Let us know where you're joining us from, your organization, and your discipline. And to enhance your experience, you may enable closed captioning from your Zoom control bar by choosing captions. And as always, for joining us today, a recording of this session, the panel discussion, presentation slides, and links to featured resources will be sent directly to you after the webinar. And our key learning objectives for today's session: to understand risk and protective factors faced by Indigenous populations by looking at scoping reviews, as well as innovative and promising programs to enhance connection and well-being. To gain knowledge and understanding on Indigenous youth trajectories and psychological functioning in the face of risk and adversity. And to highlight promising strategies to bring changes in practice and policy by listening to the voices of Indigenous foster care and adopted youth, intergenerational residential school survivors, and Indigenous child welfare workers. And now to meet our moderator, Dr. Christopher Mushquash, Vice President of Research at Thunder Bay Regional Health Science Center and Chief Scientist at Thunder Bay Regional Health Research Institute. Christopher Mushquash is a researcher and clinician who integrates traditional knowledge into his work, exploring sustainable ways of healing that also address systemic problems that Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous youth, continue to face in Canada. His research and practice have contributed to improved outcomes in Indigenous communities and enhanced understanding of the nature of developmental and intergenerational trauma in First Nations people to improve clinical care. Dr. Mushquash's research has upended conventional understandings of mental health in Indigenous families and established best practices for engaging Indigenous people in research. He has directly influenced federal funding policies in First Nation communities and assisted leaders of those communities to advocate for culturally and contextually informed services for their people. And at this point, I'm honored to turn the session over to Dr. Mushquash and our 8 presenting authors.
Thanks so much, Jane. Very, very pleased to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Presuming everyone can see the slides.
Yes, it's perfect.
I do apologize. I am a little bit under the weather today, so I'll try not to cough too loudly in case you're wearing headphones. Again, a great privilege to be here to be able to moderate this panel today and to join this group of authors who contributed to the special issue. I want to start with a special thanks to the co-editors of this journal, Dr. Lisa Ellington, Dr. Nicole Racine, and certainly Dr. Christine Wickley as well, the editor-in-chief, who's here with us today. Really looking forward to all of the conversation that we have and from the presenters. I understand there's as many as 650 people registered for this session from around the world, and just noticing the chat, I'm seeing just how great it is to see and meet colleagues from all over. I'm calling in today from Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, which is in traditional territory with the Anishinaabe people of the Fort William First Nation in the larger Robinson Superior Treaty area, which includes 13 First Nation communities, one of which is my own First Nation, Mushquash, Case Platte First Nation. So I'm very pleased to be here. The Indigenous Youth Wellbeing, Risk and Resilience special issue really addresses really a range of diversity of papers from around the world that address a range of issues. Very important to many of us here on the call. It's certainly very important. We've sort of arranged the journal, the special issue, in 4 different pillars of work. Pillar 1 being risk and protective factors faced by Indigenous populations. So this can include scoping reviews, knowledge and understanding on Indigenous youth trajectories, psychological functioning in the face of psychological functioning in the face of risk and adversity, promising strategies to bring changes in practice and policy by listening to voices of Indigenous foster care or adopted youth, intergenerational residential school survivors, and Indigenous child welfare workers. And finally, innovative and promising programs or applications to enhance connection and well-being. We're very thankful to the journal and the publisher for this opportunity to highlight very important areas of research in Indigenous youth well-being. Pardon me. I look I'm tremendously honored to be here with so many people doing such excellent community engaged work with Indigenous people from around the world. We do know that, unfortunately, we still, Indigenous people internationally still experience a range of disparity in outcome, let's say, when it comes to well-being. And for me, it's very encouraging to have so many people interested in hearing about these papers, reading these papers, but importantly, to have so many people engaged in community work that is aimed at helping to improve those outcomes. So, time to meet our presenters. Our first 2 presenters are Sandy Whitehawk and Ashley Sanders. Sandy Whitehawk is a Sikandu Lakota adoptee from Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. He's the founder and director of First Nations Repatriation Institute, which is the first organization of its kind whose goal is to create a resource for First Nations people impacted by foster care or adoption to return home, reconnect, reclaim identity. Sandra organizes Truth Healing Reconciliation Community Forums, brings together adoptees, fostered individuals, and their families and professionals with the goal to identify post-adoption issues and to identify strategies that will prevent removal of First Nations children. He's the elder in residence for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and served as commissioner for the Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's an honored witness of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on residential schools in Canada. And with Sandy is Ashley Landers. Ashley is an assistant professor in human development and family science at the Ohio State University. She's a community engaged scholar whose program of research in partnership with First Nations Repatriation Institute focuses on families and child welfare, specifically American Indian, Alaskan Native families involved with child welfare system. Findings of this scholarship have been used to achieve social change in response to identified needs within the Native community related to child removal, reunification, and adoption. Welcome both.
Good morning, everyone. I'm slightly distracted in seeing all our relatives who are from across the United States and Canada and the globe. It's very, very honored to be here. I want to say before I get started that want to say greet all the relatives that are here, and that I am Sichangu Lakota, which means I'm from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, and that my work has been primarily around educating individuals and families and communities about what happens post-adoption and foster care, because over the time of sharing my story with individuals, I noticed a huge similarity that we were all experiencing the same thing. So the survey was born out of a frustration I had in witnessing a court, a decision being made on a family for foster family to keep these Indian children and not focusing on healing the family that was in crisis. And I was very frustrated that I knew there was no guarantee that the child would be doing any better in a foster home and or an adoptive home. And so I thought, well, how do we prove that? How do we show that? And I knew that we needed a piece of research that showed that, which is where we Ashley came in as an intern at the University of Minnesota, who took it upon herself to say, yes, I'm very interested in this too, because she was in family counseling and also interested in reunification. So we launched our first survey. I wanted to mention about the survey that it is the largest of its kind. It's the first of its kind to really focus on outcomes of placement. And I think, yeah, so you see here on the screen that we had, oh, these are not the numbers, I'm sorry. Next slide. Nope, back up. Back up. There, thank you. So here are the numbers, and I really want you to notice the amount of sexual abuse and physical abuse and emotional abuse experienced in the homes. As you look at it, you can see that over 50% reported physical and emotional abuse. And the rates for Native American children who were placed was higher than their white counterparts. These numbers are from a previous article that was published, but I wanted you to see that because I know that we're looking at family preservation. In order to do that, we have to show that certainly families deserve that opportunity first and foremost, but secondly, adoption and foster care are not the solution. Next slide. Ashley?
So thank you, Sandy. It's important for Sandy to orient you to the purpose behind the study that was carried out and for you to understand that this partnership has been in the works since 2012. And I'm a non-Indigenous scholar invited into the community by Sandy Whitehawk, and I have her permission to talk with you today. I apologize in advance if I say anything disrespectful or that doesn't fit with your experience or the experiences of the families that you work with. But these are the experiences of those who participated in our survey. Sandy, you highlighted a little bit about the abuse rates. And so the takeaway from a previous article published in the journal was that even though foster care and adoption is often claimed to intend to protect children, there's incredible rates of harm and abuse that occur in the foster and adoptive family context. And so it's not a guarantee. Fast forward, we're now looking at things like reunification. And the article published in this special issue focuses on what we're calling relative reunification. And that's important because Sandy would say we're all related, and this is the connection of family members across their communities. So one of the things that we want you to understand is that reunification can sometimes occur with people other than the primary caregiver, parent, mother, or father For example, many people find their way home, and while they were looking for one loved one, find others. And so people in our study had reunified with not just their parents, mothers and fathers, but with other caregivers, aunts, uncles, grandparents, as well as other extended family members, whether that be adoptive relatives, siblings, nieces, nephews, cousins. And ultimately, many talked about reunifying with tribe and becoming reintegrated. When we think about the perceptions of what is this experience of reunification like for people in our study, they talk about it as a very complex process that has both positive and negative emotions associated with it. So many, as they're finding their way home, are experiencing joy and happiness and relief, but also finding your way home only happens when there's been separation. And so people are also experiencing mourning and grief over that original loss and separation from their family. So the complex experience of reunification has many emotional reactions. And of course, there are also comprehensions about what it means to find your way home and finding a sense of place and belonging, history, heritage, and ultimately healing. Many are able to find their communities and that resemblance with people who look like them or have a shared history with them. That resemblance of mirroring back their Indigenous identity is incredibly important and provides healing elements. One of the biggest takeaways that we want is that you remember that reunification can only occur following separation. So while reunification it can be a joyful experience, there would be no need for reunification if there was not a separation of these loved ones from their family members originally. Next slide.
We've been given a ceremony to welcome our relatives home, and that takes a longer time period than we have to explain here, but I'm going to leave you with this. Culture is healing, and understanding your place in your community, even though you were removed, is what brings the healing. And our ceremonies do restore that innocence in our heart and our spirit. It instills hope, dignity, pride, self-esteem, and most importantly, sense of belonging. That's it.
Thank you so much, both Ashley and Sandy, for your presentation. My camera feature doesn't seem, if someone on the other side is able to turn on my camera feature, that'd be helpful. Our next presenter is Dr. Christine Weckerly. Very, very pleased to introduce Christine. Christine is the editor-in-chief at Child Abuse and Neglect and co-editor-in-chief for the Elsevier and ISPSCAN New Journal Child Protection Practice. Dr. Weckerly has a background in clinical psychology and is the current editor-in-chief, as I mentioned, academic affiliations in pediatrics, as well as psychiatry at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. There's some links there to extensive youth resilience research that you can review. I'm very happy to be working with Christine. We first met somewhere around 2007 or 2008 when I was a graduate student at a conference, and have since enjoyed working together on a number of projects and papers, as well as enjoying some good meals together and discussions about rock and roll and many other things. So without any further ado, Dr. Weckerly.
Thank you so much, Chris, and I've enjoyed so much working with you as well. I'm going to be talking about a scoping review that is a collaboration with McMaster health science students, including an Indigenous student. And these students are typically trying to orient towards medical school or healthcare. And Chris is also part of this effort. So I just want to highlight that we have a new journal. I know that's going to happen, called Child Protection and Practice, and I encourage you to check that out as well. Also want to highlight that this special issue in child abuse neglect is free access, so that you can go to the links provided by ISPSCAN and download, and I encourage that activity. It is about 6-month free access. So we're going to talk about gender-based violence and resilience in Indigenous populations. And we didn't know really what was out there, so we did a scoping review to map the work that's out there. And you may find a fair bit on gender-based violence, but when we want to really focus on the resilience piece and we require the articles to have that, there's much less articles available. Next slide, please. So here, in McMaster University, we have a standard Indigenous land acknowledgement, and I want to share that as well. We are very close to Six Nations of the Grand River, and in distance, and they're very much involved in developing programming within McMaster. The stark reality, though, is that 80% of the persons who are living on reserve are not in a position of having running water. And so they have to bear the burden of a cost of bringing water in, as well as contending with, water-related health issues. And I just want to acknowledge Dr. Dawn Martin-Hill for bringing me into this Oneganos project, which means water is life in Mohawk, and to really become much more aware and connected to the realities. And I just encourage you to go to the Oneganos website for articles there. So I came in as really someone looking at youth and resilience. And at the end of this slide, at the end of this show, there'll be a resource slide where we created with youth resilience curriculum that could be used. So it's open access, and I encourage you to check out those videos on the YouTube channel that's listed. Next slide, please. So in terms of our funding here in Canada, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or CIHR, has an institute dedicated to Indigenous health research, and they've put out a statement around how they see gender. And I just want to read this to you from an elder that is advising the Institute. We're more than male, more than female. We have many genders in the time of old ones before contact with our people, so pre-settler, the Indigenous people, we knew there were more than male and female. All the people, everyone was accepted and held a special role. So the phrase two-spirit is a modern phrase, but within each nation's languages, there is often unique words to capture persons who embody both the male spirit and the female spirit, and that the special roles that two-spirit persons had would be things like being mediators in the community, being medicine people, and so forth. So we definitely have a lot to learn from Western people have a lot to learn from the Indigenous approach, and really grounding everything in relationality. And just want to echo that as a non-Indigenous person. Next slide, please. So in our scoping review, we came down to 8 articles that could be included, primarily primarily qualitative and one mixed method. So, really pleased to see our first presenter talk about a survey, because we do need that kind of numbers knowledge as well to complement the qualitative knowledge or the in-depth knowledge that you get from interviews. And 3 of the articles came from Canada, 2 from the States, 1 Mexico, Guatemala, and Israel was looking at the Bedouin community. So 3 of the articles included two-spirit persons, and there was a range of types of gender-based violence, including intimate partner violence, or IPV, child marriage, child maltreatment and child sexual abuse, sex trafficking, and father abuse. In terms of capturing resilience, one of the studies used a Western resilience questionnaire. And the resilience factors are very much echoing our first presenter in terms of traditional knowledge, whether that is language, nations that originated with a matriarchy type model of a governance rather than a patriarchy. So much less hierarchical, much more in terms of a circle than top down. Cultural practices like ceremonies, supportive law enforcement, so supportive police engagement. They specifically mentioned the availability of trauma-informed care for males with a history of sexual trauma. And just knowing that we often do not acknowledge sexual abuse of males, and that is part of a systemic issue that we don't like to, as a community, discuss that. Next slide, please. So the CIHR has adopted the medicine wheel, which you see the visual here, noting that that is developed from particular nations, not necessarily all nations, within what's called Canada. And I really have to use that in quotation marks because we would more properly refer to that as Turtle Island. So you do have these sections of emotions, spiritual, physical, and mental well-being that we need to bring in balance with a belonging, community, meaning and purpose, and the history and stories being really important. And that leads to the more central places of, feeling stability, feeling like you're contributing, having a strong connection to the land or the waters, all the animals, learning from animals, and language. So that what we do need to see is a continuing elevation of Indigenous scholarship and funding of research, especially survivor-led research. When we're talking about gender-based violence, we need to recognize the role of trauma and how we actualize trauma-informed care, and really want to see movement in survivor-led theories of Indigenous resilience. And we do recognize there's no such thing as a pan-Indigenous approach, that each nation has specific geographies, etc. That's important to them. Thanks so much, and I'll respond to your questions in the Q&A. And there's the resource for you to check out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Weckerly. Happy to introduce our next presenter. The next presenter is Marielle de la Sablonnière Griffin, and I apologize for my French, my limited ability in French. I promise to do my best. Marielle, Dr. Sablonnière Griffin is an assistant professor at the INRS Center, Urbanisation, Culture, Society, and a member of the Joint Research Unit in Indigenous Studies. Been working in research with First Nations partners for more than 15 years and is interested in the well-being of Indigenous children and youth, particularly in terms of their interactions with social services, including child protection services. Her current research program seeks to document and support Indigenous communities in their work towards self-determination and governance of child and family services. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So I'm really happy to be here presenting today. But first of all, I do want to acknowledge that I'm joining this webinar from a territory nowadays called Val d'Or in the province of Quebec in Canada. But this is the traditional Anishinaabe territory, which is called Nitakinan in Anishinaabe-Moan. So the article I'm presenting today stems from my doctoral research. I'm sort of bringing you to the eastern end of the province of Quebec with the Innu First Nations partners. So there was a regional partnership with child protection service providers, both Innu and mainstream, to better serve the regional child protection population using administrative data. So one of the identified priorities through the partnership was recurrence, and thus I designed my doctoral studies around this issue with the support from the regional partnership as an advisory committee. And the time allotted today, of course, I will not be able to do justice to the incredible partners, but I do want to say that over the years, the partnership faced many challenges. We're talking, it started around 2014. But the partnership succeeded because really everyone had at heart to better service children. So I do want to say to everyone that was closely or remotely involved in this project, a really warm thank you for making it happen. Next slide, please. So 3 main objectives to document whether First Nations children were at increased risk of a first recurrence of post-investigation child protection services compared to children from the majority group. Second one was to identify the characteristics associated with a first recurrence of post-investigation child protection services specifically for First Nations children. And the third objective was to compare those findings from objective 2 to the characteristics of those children from the majority group. Quick methods section. So we use admin data over a span of 12 years. Just above 1,000 children were included, about 40% of which were First Nations. And in terms of analysis, we ran Cox proportional hazards models. Next slide, please. So in terms of main results, the First Nations children in our study were no more likely than children from the majority group to experience a recurrent episode of post-investigation child protection services. 3 factors were associated with greater risk of recurrence among the First Nations children. So being from a family known to child protection services, so those children were twice as likely as children from families not previously known to child protection services to experience recurrence. In Quebec, child protection is really a child-centered service. Thus, the children in our cohort were included if they had the first screening report that was going for investigation within the study period. But for just under half of the First Nations children, they had a brother or sister that was previously investigated. So the investigation was closed before the screening report for the child in the city was received. As well, the youngest children were at increased risk of recurrence. And the third factor was to have initially received short-term services. So those children were 5 times more likely to experience recurrence than children who received services through voluntary measures. So short-term services, it's really a short period of time. The workers doing the investigation note that the family is engaged and that the situation should be resolved quite quickly, whereas usually it's either court mandated or voluntary measures. Services that are periodically reviewed, short-term services are given, and then the case is closed. And as a note, none of these factors are related to recurrence among children from the majority group. They have their own sets of factors associated with greater risk of recurrence. Next slide. So to our knowledge, this is the first longitudinal study of recurrence specific to First Nations children. So each group, the First Nations or the majority group, had a distinct profile at case closure and as well different factors related to recurrence. So while the actual risk may be similar, what we're seeing is that the children and the families experiencing recurrence are in fact different. So this really points to the importance of studying First Nations children as a group that deserves our attention in and out of itself, and not specifically only in comparison to another group of children. I want to remind people listening or watching this webinar that, especially at the time that is covered by the data, but up to this day, that there are discriminatory funding practices by the Canadian government, and that systemic discrimination faced by First Nations people in Quebec Public Services has been acknowledged. So our results point to the importance of service designed to respond specifically to the needs of First Nations children, families, and communities, while taking into consideration past and ongoing colonialism. And the First Nations in the province of Quebec, really what they're hoping to do to achieve These kinds of services are through adequately funded, autonomous, and First Nations-led child and family services, which are currently possible through a federal law called an Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Children, Youth, and Families, but which is currently under review by Canada's Supreme Court through some provinces contesting the constitutionality of this law. So I guess next slide. That covers it for me today. And please feel free to ask your question in the Q&A, to write, or you know, I'm pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Charlotte Brandstrup Ottendal, and Charlotte's a research assistant at the Center for Public Health in Greenland at the National Institute of Public Health, which is part of the University of Southern Denmark. The center is placed both in Copenhagen and in Nuuk, and includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. Charlotte has a master's degree in public health and is mainly using epidemiological and statistical methods in her work. For the past 6 years, her research has been centered around health and well-being among youth in Greenland. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just turning on my camera. Okay, so that probably won't. Okay, so, but thank you for the presentation, Chris, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm here today to present the paper called Developing the ASIC Scale, an Adverse Childhood Experience Scale for Inuit Youth in Greenland. Yes. Next slide, please. So first, a short background about Greenland. In Greenland, there are 57,000 inhabitants, whereof 90% are Indigenous or Inuit. Adverse childhood experiences, also called ACEs, are prevalent in Greenland, and therefore we have to investigate the causes of these further. In the 90s, the original ACE study was conducted in the United States, and the results of this study showed that by combining these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, in a multi-item scale, it was possible to identify particular vulnerable groups and patterns in ACEs. But it's often overlooked that measuring scales like the ACE scale from the original ACE study cannot simply be applied to new contexts without the necessary adaptation and psychrometric validations. So what we wanted was to explore ACEs and the pattern of ACEs in an Indigenous Arctic context. And therefore, the objective of the present study was to develop a multi-item ACE scale for Inuit youth in Greenland by using modern psychrometric standards. So we used a survey called the Wellbeing Among Inuit Youth in Greenland from 2011, because it has a very comprehensive questionnaire and includes a lot of these adverse childhood experiences in the questionnaire. In the survey, we have just under 500 youths in Greenland between 15 and 18 years old. Next slide, please. So when creating the ASIC scale, we had to include a lot of items in this scale, and we based the selection of items on the original A scale, the literature, and our knowledge about what is adverse experiences in Greenland, and those we tested through item response theory. It's very important that when you create a multi-item scale, that all the items included in the scale measure the same latent trait or variable, because the scale needs to be unidimensional. When we talk about the latent trait that we are trying to measure through this multi-level scale, we often look to seek to measure a variable called the level of childhood adversity or household dysfunction. So we included 13 items in in the scale at the beginning, and we tested 13 items, which you can see them in the figure. It was suicide in close relations, marijuana use in close family, domestic violence, victim of psychological violence, free sexual abuse items, bullying, gambling, close family, alcohol abuse, divorce of parents, being victim of physical violence, and parents passing away. So we tested these 13 items through item response theory, and we found that 3 of them, bullying, divorce of parents, and parents passing away, did not meet our criteria. So we actually excluded them from the ASIC scale. So the final ASIC scale consisted of the remaining 10 items. But it's very important for me to say that these 3 items that we excluded are relevant in ACE research, but we need to be careful of how the information about them are gathered. So we'll need to do further investigations to see how we can include them in our statistical analysis and in a multi-item scale. Next slide, please. So the results of the ASIC scale showed us that more than 80% of this young population had experienced one ACE or more, one adverse childhood experience or more before they turned 18. So as you can see in the table, that some had also experienced 10 or more items or more adverse experiences. But the most prevalent ACEs that we included in the ASIC scale was psychological violence. Almost 47% of our population had experienced psychological violence in their childhood. 44% had experienced a suicide in their close relations, and 26% had experienced alcohol problems in their close family. And because we had created this multi-item scale, it was also possible for us to see how ACEs were combined. And what we found was that alcohol problems more often than not correlated with other types of abuse and neglect. So by creating this ASIC scale, we have now delivered a base for developing a screening tool to identify the most vulnerable children and youth to target interventions. And we urge researchers and professionals to use contextually adapted measuring tools like the ASIC scale when investigating children and youth health and well-being. And as the results of this study revealed a high level of ACEs among youth in Greenland, we also stressed the need to enhance early intervention programs to prevent adversities in family households with children in Greenland, especially concerning the misuse of alcohol. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Our next speakers are Michelle Levy and Melissa Holder. Michelle Levy is a research project director at the University of Kansas School of Social Welfare. She served as the principal investigator project director of the Kansas Serves Native American Families Initiative from 2018 to 2022, and is currently co-director of the school's Integrated Health Scholars Program. Ms. Levy has a master's from University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. Melissa Missy Holder is a citizen of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska and is also an assistant professor at the University of Kansas School of Social Welfare. She served as a co-investigator and evaluation team for the Kansas Serves Native American Families Initiative from 2018 to 2022. She currently serves as a co-investigator for the Bridges to Baccalaureate grant. Her research centers on relationality, intimate partner violence, and historical trauma and healing. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. We are really honored to be here today to present 2 companion papers that were published in this special issue. Our papers share the title of Growing Stronger Together. That was a catchphrase that our program used to convey our belief that families are strong already, all families have existing strengths, and all families have the capacity to learn new skills and grow stronger together. This phrase also reflected how we work together with tribal partners and how that was a critical aspect to our program, Growing Stronger Together. Next slide, please. Our initiative was called the Kansas Serves Native American Families, or KSNAF program. It took place between 2018 and 2022. We all know the big global event that happened during this time frame. And so we will talk a little bit about how the pandemic impacted our program. This program was supported by a 5-year cooperative agreement with the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families Children's Bureau. Our goal was to strengthen the well-being of Native American children who were affected by substance use by offering a culturally integrated Strengthening Families program. This initiative took place in the lands now known as Kansas, which are located, as you can see on this map, right in the middle of the United States. This project was done in partnership with the 4 tribal nations in Kansas, Haskell Indian Nations University, which is located here in Lawrence, Kansas, and with other partners. Next slide, please. One requirement of our program's funder was that we use an evidence-based practice, and we chose, in consultation with our tribal partners, to use the Strengthening Families program, which uses a standardized curriculum, but also offers some opportunities for flexibility in how the program is provided. Our Strengthening Families program served any families who identified themselves as Native American. It was delivered by group leaders who were Indigenous or had close ties to Indigenous communities. The Strengthening Families program consists of 14 2-hour sessions that focus on family bonding, communication, and supervision. Each session starts with a shared family meal. Then the caregivers and children go to their own separate groups to learn a new skill. After that, they come back together for family time to practice the new skill by doing something fun together, like playing a game, with the group leaders available for coaching and support during that time. The Strengthening Families program was designed to be an in-person intervention, so we initially began by offering this program on reservations and in other communities at sites that were familiar and convenient for families, like the Boys and Girls Club, and also offered supports such as transportation and childcare. And then COVID happened. Because of the devastating impact of COVID among our Native communities and concerns for everyone's safety, we adapted this program to do a virtual delivery through Zoom. And we offered our families and our staff tablets, mobile hotspots, cell phone minutes, tech support, whatever they needed to be able to participate from home. As you can see, the majority of our groups ended up being virtual or hybrid, with a total of 55 families served. For the families that had at least one caregiver and one child complete the program, 10 of the 14 sessions, they were designated as graduates from the program. You can see here a picture of one of our in-person graduation celebrations. Next slide, please. So our first paper focuses on the implementation of the program, meaning the development and the delivery of the Strengthening Families program and how we centered Indigenous communities in those efforts. Doing this work was a collaborative effort, and so was writing these papers. So we wanted to acknowledge each co-author that contributed to this effort and to express our gratitude for our tribal community partners and the families who joined us on this journey. I'd now like to turn things over to my colleague to tell you more. Next slide, please.
Hi, Neepi. Good morning. Michelle, thank you for that overview of our program and our initiative. As one of the Indigenous or Native staff members involved since the inception of the grant, it was important to find an approach that involved Native values and were representative of Indigenous values overall. We knew that by continuing to utilize the same colonized framework for services for Indigenous children and families would continue to perpetuate that lack of accountability for culture. And so we did not want the same negative outcomes for these families. So to disrupt that cycle, a new approach was needed, because we knew Indigenous beliefs and practices related to family and child rearing should be considered the foundation of culturally appropriate policies and practices. So what did that mean for our implementation? It meant that we integrated culture into the SFP curriculum. We offered SFP, as Michelle said, in spaces that honored and reflected Indigenous values and cultures. We also knew that we needed to have staff that resembled the families. So we were intentional in recruiting staff from the local tribal community, as well as the local tribal college. And we were fortunate enough to have Indigenous staff because they were able to integrate the culture into the curriculum, such as sharing parenting examples from local tribal communities. So that way we honored the diversity within those cultures, because we know that Native cultures are not a monolith. We're not all the same. And one way we did this was by using parenting, the concept of parenting as a verb, and whereby the participants were able to decide who was family, who constituted the caregiver of that particular family. So as Michelle mentioned, we had both parents as well as grandparents who were involved in these programs. Another example is that within our region, ribbon shirts and ribbon skirts, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, are common in our region. So we were fortunate enough to provide our graduates with ribbon shirts and ribbon skirts as a gift to our participants. Next slide, please.
So for our second paper, again, we'd like to acknowledge our co-authors. As part of this work, our funder, again, who was the Children's Bureau, required participation in a cross-site evaluation using specific assessments and administrative data such as child welfare records. In addition, we had the opportunity to conduct a local evaluation to understand if our culturally integrated delivery of the Strengthening Families was having the intended outcomes. And so this was really our opportunity through that local evaluation to collect and share information to be able to tell our story in a way that made sense for us and for our tribal partners. Again, I'll turn things over to my colleague to share more details about that. Next slide, please.
If you've been listening, there's probably a theme across the board of all of the articles, not just our articles that we're presenting on, but there's a theme of relationships, right? So for us, relationships and relationality was our guide, because we began to see that relationships are key and were key. And these principles listed here helped shape the trust, the purpose, and knowledge of our work. And as one team member shared, connection is huge. That is, human connections and being present in the moment. As researchers, we know that we have a responsibility to the Academy and our funders, but we also know that we have a responsibility to our participants, to those communities that we work with. And many Indigenous social workers and academics are fighting to increase data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty, which is respecting Indigenous communities, that they have a say and that we acknowledge what they say in terms of what is done with the data. So for those of us who work with Indigenous communities, need to remember that we need to be accountable to those communities. So we took that to heart in terms of our evaluation and our approach to this. A culturally responsive evaluation must start with the recognition and acknowledgement of past and current research purposes and methods that have been harmful and extractive to Indigenous communities. Rather not doing research on, but doing research with, means prioritizing Indigenous ways of knowing and distributing findings back to the community in useful ways. Recognizing the sovereignty of the community toward their own research outputs and data. Collecting and sharing stories can contribute to the decolonization of research approaches and methods. And that's one of the approaches that we took in implementing and applying the 6 principles regarding relationality that are listed on this slide. Next slide, please. So it's also important to say that as a team, to effectively tell our story, we had to have our own reflective conversations. We were intentional, obviously, about our partnerships with the community and tribal communities, as well as with our allies. Both the research and evaluation team supported the implementation team by centering the families and communities. And one way that we did this was by pushing back against the funders to offer programming that was resilience focused rather than deficit based and outcome driven. The conversation with team members occurred over time and through various methods, such as processing our notes, unstructured team storytelling sessions. And the purpose of those team storytelling sessions was to reflect on our weekly process and lessons learned and insights learned with working within those communities. We also knew that to move the program forward, we needed to work as one team. And by being able to address questions that the participants had or help with identifying resources, regardless if we were on the implementation team or evaluation team, we still had a responsibility to those communities. We are also determined to continue to support the families, as Michelle mentioned, during the pandemic. We wanted to continue to engage with those communities despite that we had a halt on any activity. So what we did was deliver food to families, we delivered household essentials and also activities for the children to stay engaged. We also understood that it was our responsibility to learn and honor the histories and cultures through intentional reflection. And we also felt that it was our responsibility to pass this knowledge of what we learned with others within our university, such as the Institutional Review Board, and as well as with our funder. And our team worked in consultation. So this is another example, is that our team worked in consultation with tribal social service providers to address the state child welfare data that did not include data from tribal social services in our state. So that's a combined effort that we did with one of the local tribes. Next slide, please. So before we conclude about our two articles, we want to share that we have two additional papers forthcoming. One will share the program's effectiveness through a quantitative lens, and the other, which we are excited about, will take a more Indigenous qualitative focus through poetic inquiry, where we share the lived experience of our caregivers through the poems. And we acknowledge that the papers are academic papers, so we also have plans to share the poems with the communities, which will hopefully be more accessible, more meaningful, and more beneficial to them. And as you can see also on this slide in the box, there are other ways that we've provided outreach, such as our program and project website, social media. We have a newsletter that still continues despite the ending of our program, and we've done community training, and then we've had resource maps that we've provided to the community as well. And also, if you want to check out our project, there is the link, the hyperlink there, and we'll put it in the chat so folks have access to that if you want to see what we've done. Thank you.
Thanks so much to both Melissa and Michelle for the presentation and papers. That concludes the author presentation portion of the webinar. Looking very, very much forward to the question and answer period now. So please feel free to share your question and answers in the question and answer feature, and we'll get to those right away. I think I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Thank you, Chris. And at this point, I'd like to welcome all of our authors to turn their cameras back on and their mics, and we will go through. I have questions coming from a lot of different places, so I'm going to start with some that were emailed to me, and then we'll hit some of the ones that were in Q&A. For the audience, any question that's been answered in Q&A, you can now view yourself, and we can also talk about those live, but if you want to go into the Q&A box. And again, please feel free to keep typing. There were a couple questions that came up that I just want to answer. So this special issue journal is open access for the next 6 months. So I strongly encourage you, we've been putting links to the individual authors' articles in the chat, but then I just sent the link to the entire special issue. I would encourage you sooner than later to access that and to be able to really take a look at the special issue in its entirety. There's such a depth of information. I would also like to comment on something that came up in the chat, that really every one of these papers could have been their own webinar. I mean, there is such depth of what the authors presented on, research, their methodologies, and so I would just really encourage you to read the articles in their entirety from that link with the special issue journal. And then the other question that came up was, Chris, I just want to ask you this, Weckerly, the curriculum that you spoke of, so how can people access that?
Great. Yes, you can go to our Resilience in Youth channel. On the slide that I provided, there are links on that slide, and I believe this slideshow is going to be available to you subsequently. And the Resilience in Youth YouTube channel has quite a wealth of videos. They're all open access. You don't need permission to use them in teaching or anything else. They are under generally 5 minutes or under. And so there's a whole set of resilience topics like art, how to understand our bodies, and these kinds of things that are paired with strategies. So how to understand our bodies talks about the vagus nerve, and then deep breathing is offered as a strategy. So they're not just content, but we try to put strategies in there as well. And there's also a series of videos of Haudenosaunee youth talking about water, their understanding of water as being, you know, essential life force. And there are other videos on just resilience in general. So there's a lot there, and I welcome anyone to go and use it. We would like these things to be used.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. And now I have a few targeted questions for some of our authors. Charlotte, a question came up about 47% of the Indigenous youth in your survey looked like they had psychological violence as part of, you know, the trauma that they brought to the survey. So can you define psychological violence?
Well, in the survey, we had a very comprehensive questionnaire about violence, and psychological violence was violence in the home towards our participant when they were children or young, and it could be threats, like verbal threats, or other kinds of emotional abuse, like being ignored by caregivers or not being met in your emotions. Yeah, so when we go through the ACE literature, it would definitely be emotional violence, like not being seen or heard by your caregivers, or something more severe, like if threats for your life or your safety.
Thank you. And then for Muriel, there was a question about the case regarding the Supreme Court case, the Constitutionality Act of Respecting First Nations Youth and Families. Can you talk a little bit about what that case is?
Yes, just very briefly. So under the Constitutional Act of Canada, what they will call Indian Affairs, so Indigenous people, is a federal responsibility, but all that is health and social services are provincial responsibilities. So the provinces have been contesting the act acknowledging the right of Indigenous people to self-determination. And so it is currently under review by Canada Supreme Court, the Quebec Appeal Superior Court. This already issued a statement, a judgment that the act was constitutional except for one section and one subsection. So basically the section saying that the Indigenous design law would supersede provincial law. So it's been brought to Canada's Supreme Court, and the judgment is going to be released this Friday, so February 9th. So this will be really important because it can really either support Indigenous right to self-determination, or it can really hinder what's gonna be happening in the coming weeks, months, years in the Canadian context. So a fair number of Indigenous groups have proceeded to have their own laws, so close to a dozen right now in Canada. But it's uncertain what's going to happen depending on the judgment that is expected on Friday.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
If I could just add a tiny bit of context for child welfare, is that this kind of structure where the federal government has kind of ruling over Indigenous nations versus the local governments has led to barriers in supporting resources, things like getting clean feeding tubes to families. And that's held within what's called Jordan's Principle, which is a requirement across Canada, not always followed. But I would just suggest people check out the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society that has a lot of information there on Jordan's Principle.
Perfect, Chris. Thank you. And there's a question for some of our authors who are non-tribal members. So obviously you are an ally in this research, but how do you build that community? How do you build that trust when you are a non-tribal member?
Ashley could share that. She's always shy about this part, so.
Yeah, so I think that learning and listening are a big part of knowing how you can be helpful. And Sandy and I's relationship is unique in that someone connected us, and I thought I was just going to learn and listen. I did not intend for this for me to serve in that role of the lead researcher. But once Sandy made that offer, 11 years later, here we are. And I'll continue to do this work as long as Sandy will have me doing it. And I think that the biggest thing is learning to listen to your elders and hearing the vision of what they want to have happen. And I think if you're doing truly engaged community work, it takes, some component of research understanding, but really like Sandy's the driving vision behind this whole project. And my job is just helping her answer the questions that she wants to answer and helping to work with the publications to tell the stories that she's known anecdotally for many years and wants to put forward now in research. So I think part of it is approaching the community if you're going to do that, and learning and listening and seeing if there's a role for you. But I also think those partnerships are incredibly important just across the board, regardless of whether you're going to be doing research in this area, and respecting your elders.
Oh, well said. And Michelle and Melissa, do you have anything to add to this?
That was very well said. I don't know if I have a lot to add, just to echo the listening more than talking, respect, humility. It just takes time to build relationships. And, we found it really helpful once we were welcomed into communities to just go and be there face to face and get to know people. And don't go in right off the bat asking for something or with your kind of own agenda, but just start by getting to know folks and build on that. This has been a really amazing experience today, just hearing from all of the great work that's happening around the world. So also appreciate being invited to this space today.
Thank you. So I have a comment/question that came through via email. It says many parents of vulnerable children or children with trauma need access to resources. This particular audience member felt that sometimes there is a hesitancy, and probably for good reason, to access external resources outside of what might be, part of that Native community. Like, can you speak to that? This barrier to maybe external resources that weren't specifically tailored for Indigenous youth?
I'm not sure who would like to pick up on that. I think that what we do see is this very quick adoption of technology among Indigenous youth, and that Indigenous youth have really pushed forward their own kind of resource development and discussion. And so I think there may be some technology sort of places where youth can go to find support. And in terms of like things like suicidality, I do recommend to write Love on Her Arms is one group that does put out really great messaging. So, I mean, if you're looking for a quick move, just looking at what kind of social media sites you might recommend that provide really good messaging and information. But certainly welcome others to speak to this.
Would anyone else like to comment? Actually, Chris, you springboarded us into probably a whole nother webinar topic, but have any of you found that the access to technology and to social media and how that has changed the dynamic for Indigenous youth as well? I mean, the world is obviously at every youth's fingertips, and I'm sure that's same with the Indigenous communities. Like, I'm curious what you think of that.
I know Sandy could talk about this a little bit, about thinking about the movement that's happening now on Twitter and social media of adoptees and adoptees using their voices, and adoptees talking about adoption as trauma, adoption as trafficking. There's a whole movement happening online where adult adopted individuals are coming forward and saying, while I did not consent to the adoption that occurred in my life, I have a right and a voice to talk about my experience. So that's a really powerful movement. And while youth are participating in that and adults are participating in that, I know Sandy is very in tune with that. And I think that we also see people reconnecting with their home and their culture and their community members. So social media is aiding in those relationships and reunifications. It's helping people feel connected to their loved ones across the country.
There's also what they call an adoptee movement right now. Adult adoptee movement is, I don't think they've become a 501 yet, but they have organized and wanting to impact adoption policy in their states, because right now the severing of your family it is also a legal issue, which they want to change. And so, yeah, 20 years ago, when I said adoption was trauma, people just looked at me and politely blinked and thought, well, she's just a maladjusted adoptee. And I'm thinking, no, I'm having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And so right now it is all out there. If you're not on Twitter or X, get on there and put adoption, and you will see wonderful comments really express succinctly on what that emotional isolation of adoption feels like. So yeah, when you said social media, I just kind of went, if you hadn't spoke up, Ashley, I would have went, I'm old and I don't think like that, even though I'm on there reading. It's weird.
And Michelle, did you have a comment as well?
Actually, I think it was Missy. I saw her start to end.
I was just going to go off of what Ashley said. I think that it's important that all youth, but in this case, Indigenous youth, are understanding the importance of consent. So in social media, I know that's one of the things that my children have said, ask before you post a picture of me, you know, and I'm their mother. So I think even understanding that and what they're getting through their schools is important about consent. And that can go in a lot of different ways. It can go, you know, like, you know, you didn't get my consent to, you know, give me to another family, or, you know, those kinds of things. So I think consent is important across the board.
Perfect, thank you. And there were some comments about parents. There wasn't a lot of research or a lot of discussion today in your research about the engagement of parents in solutions and how to really enhance the well-being of Indigenous youth through education and programs and structure that support the parents in these communities. I didn't know if any of you wanted to speak to that. Chris, any thoughts?
I think that Sandy is trying to talk, but Sandy,
Oh.
you're muted.
No, I wasn't trying to talk. I just laughed that nobody was saying anything, and yet, no, everyone's got a great opinion on this. I just felt like I'm talking too much. So,
Oh, please go ahead.
okay. So I think what I heard from, I think it's Michelle, and when she was talking about their program, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but it made the most sense, because I think parenting classes make no sense. But I think parenting up, you know, being in a community where you can see how mothers and fathers and grandparents interact with children, because I know for myself, I came from such, I didn't know anything about kindness or nurturing, because it wasn't modeled to me. I didn't experience it. So when I had children, I didn't know how to do it. Literally did not know how to do it. And so, but when I watched others do it, I was like, oh, I want that. You know, because I saw how when there was that kindness expressed, how the child looked at her mother. And I was like, what is that? Whatever it is, I want it. And so I learned that it was, you know, what was going on with me, but that wasn't that wasn't a setup. That was just a neighbor. It's a longer story, but I was very greatly impacted, and began healing and became the parent I was meant to be. But we can replicate that like you guys did. You had your evening, people come over, and it isn't like, hey, pay attention to how I see how I'm parenting this. No, you just see it naturally. And when you can see it and organically in that way, I don't know, there's somehow shame is alleviated and everything, and you just, it just comes out naturally, because every single parent has in them to parent the child that chose them to be their parents. And so they can bring that out in you. And my daughter's 47, my son's 42, 41. And I'm 70. And I'm still, my grandchildren now are the ones who are continuing that healing for me, by just observing them and going, oh my gosh, we've broke a cycle. Look at the children have freedom. They can, it's just, yeah, it goes until we leave this realm, this healing that the children bring. So when you can set up a situation for that to happen, I think that's more impactful than reading about child development.
Oh, that was wonderfully said. And I agree with you. The community needs to embrace the parents as much as they need to embrace the youth. And that's how we really heal, and that's how we really move forward. That's wonderfully said. So I encourage the audience. I know that we had quite a few questions in the Q&A box that were answered. So hopefully all of your particular questions for particular authors were answered there. There was one that just came through. It says, for Strengthening Families program, how did you address parenting from different nations? I know you made mention of the pan-Indigenous aspect, but it's important to pay attention to too. And I think that could be a general question for all of you in your research. How did you address, parenting and issues from different nations?
Yeah, that's something that part of our storytelling processing occurred is, how do we approach this situation, with folks from different tribal nations. And we really encouraged the parents to share as much as possible, identifying what are those commonalities that they had amongst each other, and sharing, this is how we do whatever X, Y, and Z within, my tribal nation. And, hoping that, they learn from each other, encouraging that conversation to occur among parents. Because, I'm a citizen of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, but I grew up in our local community. So I know some things, but I'm also not an expert. So being an outsider from a different tribal community was also important for us to sit back and listen, but provide examples from some of the tribal nations that, we are familiar with, and encourage folks to hopefully find out if they don't know, or, encourage them to share what they do know if they do know something. And those are not very specific answers, but those are just kind of the different approaches that we took. Michelle, I don't know if you recall anything specifically that we did within those programming events.
I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, of course, but I think what you described is exactly how the program evolved. Having those staff who were Indigenous themselves and came with a very non-judgmental approach as well, respect, listening, letting the parents talk with each other, and providing examples, as you shared, Missy, from their own experience or from others' experiences that they've been involved with. It was intentionally inclusive in that way.
Perfect. Thank you to both of you. And I really want to now just ask our authors, just very briefly, to provide us with your research, a key takeaway, and or where you would like to see the research to go from here. So, Chris, I'm going to start with you if that works. Weckerly? Oh, I think you're muted, Chris. Sorry.
I'm always doing that. I think that it would be really, really wonderful to be able to continue the research and galvanize Indigenous scholarship, and for the particular article we did. So it's really, that focus on resilience and understanding the array of gender-based violence and what the communities that have developed model programming, Indigenous communities who have developed their programming, to be able to get that information out. And so that across different nations, across the globe, that we could have some collaboration and see some common ground. And even though we recognize that like a pan-Indigenous approach is difficult.
All right, thank you. Michelle and Melissa?
I guess one takeaway, besides involving parents and the children in the development of, moving forward and pushing a big gap back against funders, is that Indigenous data sovereignty, regardless if it's quantitative or quantitative or qualitative, is important, and that it's acknowledging that it's an act of resistance, right? We talk about resilience in this space, but it's an act of resistance, and giving that power and knowledge to those tribal communities. And then I think that we also shared within our presentation that we do have some articles forthcoming. So hopefully once those get to the next stage, then we can share those. So.
I'll just add one more thing to that, another teaser for those hopefully out to come articles, just the importance of being able to share the caregivers' lived experiences in their own words, not with our interpretation or translation or coming up with the themes, but really letting their words stand alone. And so I know Missy mentioned how excited we were about trying this new methodology of doing a research poem. So we're excited about being able to share that both through a more traditional academic audience, as well as finding ways to share those words back with the communities that we worked with, because they are their words. So thank you.
We look forward to that. Please share it with us when you produce those articles, because we can add them to this webinar page and they will live permanently with the rest of the resources that we talked about today. And then Sandy and Ashley, what are your key takeaways, or where you want your research to go?
Okay, I'm very radical about this. I want our research to really abolish adoption and foster care as it exists. And I want our experts, we're not calling them that, we're just saying they have lived experience. They are the experts in how this should come about in the future. You know, we don't, as far as I know, an adoptive couple is not even, no emotional IQ is offered to them, no MMPI, nothing. We just believe that because somebody wants a child, that they deserve one. And our families should not have to be the providers of those who cannot parent biologically. And that's what the bent is here. We have become a commodity. I want our research to show that our families have it within them to parent their children, that what they need is a reconnection to culture, a sense of belonging themselves. If you would have saw me when I had my first child, you would have just said what someone did say to me. I don't know how you're going to be a parent. You're never sober. You're never not high. And yet today I'm the grandparent that will watch a family or mother or maybe a single father in the store and their child's having a meltdown because they can't afford, most likely, what the child's crying over. I'm the one that goes up and says, "Excuse me, I would love to buy that for your little one." And for $20, I get to just experience an incredible smile and happiness and a sigh of relief from the parent. So changes, they're there. We have to follow them, not us lead.
Yeah,
Ashley.
Sandy, I think, would also say, and has talked about for a long time, the FNRI's slogan, generation after generation, we're coming home. And there's a whole group of fostered and adopted individuals who are finding their way home. And, the 7th generation principle says those people are prayed home by their relatives, right? Their ancestors. So those who are returning through child welfare today were prayed home by their mothers and grandmothers and back 7 generations. And I think that there's a lot of healing that can happen in the community when we look towards how culture and knowledge within the community can be a resource. Communities know how to heal themselves. If they turn to traditional knowledge and storytelling and song and ceremony, you have all of that wisdom that can be used to help heal the community.
So beautifully said by both of you. Muriel, would you like to share your takeaways?
Yes, sure. So we've talked about relationship earlier, even in the Q&A or presentation. So in terms of, where this is leading to, well, as a non-Indigenous researcher, really my role is in supporting my Indigenous partners in affirming their inherent right to self-determined services, which I've been building from the research I presented today to what I'm doing currently, including doing research that respects OCAP principles. So in Canada, ownership, control, access, and sorry, I'm thinking in French. English is my second language, and possession, like physical possession of the data. So really having a partnership that respects all these, that the First Nations are owner and need to control and the access and have the physical or electronic ownership and possession of the data. And I really just want to commend the anonymous contributor who just noted that maybe in talking in English, which is my second language, I may have not used proper terminology, but I do, want to really recognize that Indigenous people have inherent sovereignty over their own people, but that yes, the constitutional jurisdiction dispute is only one way in a colonial system, but that doesn't prevent at all anything, because First Nations and Indigenous people more generally in Canada are sovereign of their own nations.
Thank you, Muriel. And then Charlotte.
Thank you, Jane. So one of the key messages in this article I brought today is that when we do epidemiological and statistical investigations with Indigenous communities, we need to use measuring scales and questions which are relevant and adapted to the community we're doing the investigations in. And this article is an example where we did the whole scale validation thing with the multi-item scale, but it's also it's very important to say that we cannot simply use instruments from other contexts and use them on equal terms in Indigenous communities. And whereas where this research is going, we use it right now currently to develop a new alcohol policy in Greenland with which has a focus on the social consequences of the alcohol misuse in Greenland. So just to be brief, thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. I look forward to your further research as well. And Dr. Mushquash, I was going to have you close down the session with your closing comments.
Oh yeah, no, thank you so much to all of the authors, panelists. Thanks so much for the interactive audience. Very, very nice to see so much interest, so much enthusiasm. This Zoom feature on the webinar side has the small reactions kind of flying by as people are, there's one now, a little heart. And so I see lots of clapping, lots of thumbs up, and lots of hearts to a lot of the statements that the authors had made. And so certainly a lot of support. And for me, a lot of hopefulness as we have a global community that has a lot of interest in the health of Indigenous young people. And that's very, very important, I know, to all of us here. So Chimigwech for the opportunity to moderate this session. And again, it's been a tremendous privilege and an honor to be involved with so many great people who are dedicated to our communities and our people.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our authors, to Chris for moderating the session. This is, I hope that you were able to look at the chat. I hope you're able to see just the tremendous amount of excitement around finally covering this topic in such great depth. I think everyone looks forward to further research and again, to keep the conversation going. As Chris Beckerly and I always say, it can't stop here. You just have to keep it going. This is the beginning. I will just remind you that you will get in a follow-up email to all of our audience, the recording of the session, the presentation slides, any of the resources that the authors shared. They'll send the links to me. I will post them on that page. That will be a permanent page in our ISPCAN Knowledge Hub. So I encourage, again, our authors, as additional research comes out and additional findings, I can continue to populate that page, so anyone who searches by topic will have access to not only what was covered here, but where we go in the future with this. I'll also send the follow-up email. We're excited about our new open access journal. Chris Weckerly did a webinar with us last week on how to publish in a practice-based journal with great tips. I'll send the links to those recordings as well. And again, for our audience, I just want to say that, there's a brief Zoom survey at the conclusion when you disconnect. We're always trying to make the webinars better. We're always trying to hit the topics that are important to you, because that is really the role we want to play, is to give you the information you need to help us change systems of care for children. So please fill out that survey. It takes 3 minutes, super easy, super quick, but we do look and we do try to adapt and make changes. So thank you to everyone. What an amazing session. Again, to our authors and to Chris, thank you so much. And to everyone, have a good day or night or wherever you may be. And thanks for joining us. Bye, everyone.